This is absolutely out of control. WWE's backstage area turned into a war zone on Friday night when Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu couldn't even wait until their scheduled match to tear each other apart, and what I'm about to tell you is going to make you question everything you thought you knew about professional wrestling safety protocols. These two grown men, two elite athletes who were supposed to be professionals, destroyed thousands of dollars of equipment, put multiple crew members in danger, and created a situation so volatile that Triple H himself had to physically intervene before someone ended up in the hospital or worse. And here's what's going to make your blood absolutely boil. I need you to drop a comment right now if you think WWE is encouraging this kind of reckless, dangerous behavior, because what happened backstage at SmackDown wasn't just two wrestlers getting into a fight. This was a calculated piece of chaos that WWE not only allowed to happen, but actively filmed and promoted as if endangering their own employees and talent is somehow entertainment. This is the kind of irresponsible booking that's going to get someone seriously hurt, and when that happens, WWE won't be able to claim they didn't see it coming. But before we get into the shocking details of what actually went down in that backstage brawl, and trust me, what you saw on television was heavily edited to hide just how out of control things really got, I need you to smash that like button if you think WWE has crossed a line with this level of reality in their storytelling. Because what I'm about to reveal about the behind-the-scenes politics that led to this brawl, the legitimate injuries that were suffered, and the furious reactions from other wrestlers who witnessed this chaos is going to change how you view WWE's current approach to blurring the lines between work and shoot. Let me take you through exactly what happened on Friday night at SmackDown, because the version you saw on television, as intense as it was, doesn't even come close to capturing the absolute mayhem that unfolded backstage. Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu were scheduled to face each other in what was being billed as a Glasgow Street fight later in the show, a match designed to capitalize on the legitimate tension that has been building between these two men for weeks. But according to multiple eyewitnesses who were backstage during the taping, Drew and Jacob couldn't even make it to their scheduled match time before things exploded. The confrontation started in catering, where wrestlers are supposed to be able to eat and relax before their segments, when Drew allegedly made a comment about Jacob's family that crossed a line. Now, I don't have the exact words that were said because the people I've spoken to either didn't hear them or aren't willing to repeat them, but whatever Drew said, it set Jacob off. Jacob Fatu, who weighs 295 pounds of pure Samoan warrior intensity, reportedly launched himself across the catering area at Drew McIntyre. Tables were overturned, food went flying everywhere, and other wrestlers who were trying to eat their meals had to scramble out of the way to avoid becoming collateral damage. Drew, to his credit, didn't back down. The Scottish warrior met Jacob's aggression with equal intensity, and suddenly these two monsters were throwing genuine bombs at each other while everyone around them scattered. But here's where it gets really crazy, and this is the part that has me absolutely furious with WWE management. Instead of immediately breaking up the fight, instead of separating these two men before someone got seriously hurt, WWE's production crew started filming. They made a conscious decision to capture this organic moment for television rather than prioritizing the safety of their talent and crew. That decision tells you everything you need to know about WWE's current priorities. The fight spilled out of catering and into the hallway, with Drew and Jacob crashing into walls, destroying production equipment, and generally creating absolute chaos. I've been told that at one point, Jacob Fatu had tossed Drew McIntyre into a lighting rig that was being stored against the wall, and the rig, which costs tens of thousands of dollars, was completely destroyed. Drew responded by grabbing a steel road case and using it as a battering ram, driving Jacob backward through a door that led into one of the locker room areas. By this point, other wrestlers were starting to emerge from their locker rooms to see what all the commotion was about, and what they witnessed was described to me as legitimately frightening. These weren't worked punches or choreographed spots. Drew and Jacob were genuinely trying to hurt each other, throwing shoot strikes that echoed through the hallway, and the hatred in their eyes was real and undeniable. Security tried to intervene multiple times, but here's a question I want you to think about. What is security supposed to do when two men the size of Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu are determined to fight? These aren't average-sized people you can just restrain or separate easily. These are elite athletes, trained fighters, men who could legitimately hurt anyone who gets between them. The security personnel did their best, but they were completely overwhelmed by the situation. It took the arrival of Triple H, accompanied by several of SmackDown's biggest and strongest wrestlers, to finally separate Drew and Jacob. And even then, according to witnesses, both men were still trying to get at each other, still screaming threats and insults, still completely consumed by their mutual hatred. Triple H reportedly had to get directly in Drew's face and essentially threaten him with suspension or worse if he didn't back down, and even that barely worked. Now, here's what makes this entire situation so frustrating and concerning. WWE made the decision to air this footage on television. They took what should have been a serious incident requiring internal discipline and investigation, and they turned it into content. They edited the footage, added dramatic music, and presented it to the audience as if this kind of dangerous, reckless behavior is something to be celebrated rather than condemned. And I need you to understand something. I'm not some pearl-clutching, safety-obsessed critic who thinks wrestling should be sanitized and boring. I love intense, hard-hitting wrestling. I love when wrestlers blur the lines between character and reality. But there's a difference between controlled intensity that creates compelling television and actual dangerous situations where people could get legitimately hurt. The backstage area of a wrestling show is filled with equipment, cables, crew members, and other wrestlers. It's not a safe environment for an uncontrolled brawl. When Drew and Jacob were throwing each other into walls and equipment, they weren't just risking their own safety, they were endangering everyone around them. What if a crew member had been seriously injured by falling equipment? What if another wrestler had been caught in the crossfire? Who would be responsible then? Let me tell you about some of the reactions from other wrestlers who were backstage during this incident, because those reactions are really revealing about how the locker room feels about this situation. According to multiple sources, the roster is divided on whether what happened was awesome or irresponsible. Some wrestlers, particularly the younger guys and those who come from indie backgrounds where this kind of intensity is more common, thought the brawl was incredible. They saw it as two guys who were so committed to their characters and their storyline that they couldn't contain their emotions even backstage. They viewed it as authentic and compelling, the kind of real emotion that makes wrestling feel legitimate and important. But other wrestlers, particularly veterans, and those with families who worry about their safety, were furious. They felt that Drew and Jacob were being reckless and selfish, putting their own storyline above the safety and well-being of everyone else backstage. They were angry that WWE management allowed the situation to escalate rather than shutting it down immediately. And they were concerned that this incident sets a precedent where wrestlers feel like they have to engage in dangerous, uncontrolled behavior to get attention and TV time. One veteran wrestler, who spoke to me on condition of anonymity, said something that really stuck with me: there's a difference between working hard and working stupid. Drew and Jacob worked stupid, and WWE rewarded them for it by putting it on TV. What message does that send to everyone else? That's a damn good question. What message does this send? If you're a mid-card wrestler trying to get noticed, trying to break through to the next level, are you now supposed to start real fights backstage? Are you supposed to endanger yourself and others in pursuit of that viral moment that might elevate your position on the card? Is that really the culture WWE wants to cultivate? Now let's talk about the match itself, because after all that chaos, Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu still had to actually face each other in the Glasgow Street fight that was scheduled for later in the show. And here's where things get even more complicated and controversial: the scheduled match was cancelled. That's right, after spending the entire show building to this confrontation, after hyping the Glasgow Street fight all week, after showing the backstage brawl footage that got everyone invested in seeing these two men destroy each other in the ring, WWE pulled the match from the card. Triple H came out and announced that due to the uncontrollable violence that had already occurred backstage, and in the interest of safety, he was postponing the match to next week's SmackDown. The live crowd booed. Social media went nuclear. Fans who had paid money to attend SmackDown specifically to see Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu in a street fight felt cheated. And honestly, can you blame them? WWE created this massive angle, got everyone hyped for the match, and then pulled it at the last minute. That's the definition of a bait and switch. But here's the thing, and this is where I'm going to say something that might be controversial: I actually think WWE made the right decision by canceling the match, even though it pissed off the live crowd. Here's why: if Drew and Jacob had gone out there for their scheduled match after already having a legitimate backstage brawl, one of two things would have happened, and both options are bad. Option 1, they go out there and work a normal match, trying to execute their planned spots and tell the story they had prepared. But after showing everyone the real backstage fight, a worked match would have felt fake and disappointing by comparison. The audience would have been able to see the difference between the intensity of the backstage brawl and the choreographed nature of the in-ring match, and it would have actually hurt the believability of both performers. Option 2, they go out there and continue fighting with the same intensity they showed backstage, throwing genuine strikes and legitimately trying to hurt each other. But in that scenario, you're almost guaranteed to have someone suffer a serious injury. When you've already been fighting for real backstage, your body is already compromised, your adrenaline is already spiking, and your judgment is already impaired. Adding a full match on top of that is a recipe for disaster. So by canceling the match, WWE actually protected both performers while also creating a storyline reason to extend the feud and build even more heat for the eventual confrontation. It was smart booking, even if it frustrated fans in the moment. But that smart booking decision doesn't excuse the fact that WWE allowed and even encouraged the backstage brawl to happen in the first place. You can't create a dangerous situation and then pat yourself on the back for managing the consequences of that danger. That's like an arsonist taking credit for calling the fire department. Let's dig deeper into the personal issues between Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu, because understanding their history is crucial to understanding why this situation escalated so dramatically. Drew and Jacob don't have a long, established rivalry. Jacob only joined the main WWE roster relatively recently as part of the new Bloodline. So why is there such intense hatred between these two men? According to sources close to both wrestlers, the tension started several weeks ago during a backstage segment that was being filmed for SmackDown. Drew was cutting a promo about his Scottish heritage and his warrior mentality, and Jacob allegedly interrupted in a way that Drew felt was disrespectful not just to the segment but to Drew's culture and background. Words were exchanged, things got heated, and ever since then, there's been legitimate animosity between them. But it goes deeper than just one backstage incident. Drew McIntyre has been on a mission since returning to WWE after his release and independent run. He's positioned himself as one of the toughest, most legitimate fighters in the company. He takes pride in his hard-hitting style and his warrior persona. Jacob Fatu, coming from the Samoan dynasty and bringing his own reputation for intense, physical wrestling, represents a direct challenge to Drew's position as WWE's most legitimate tough guy. This isn't just about a storyline or a match, this is about two alpha males fighting for dominance and respect. This is about egos, reputations, and the pecking order in WWE's locker room. And when you add the layer of cultural pride, Drew's Scottish heritage and Jacob's Samoan bloodline, you've got a powder keg of emotions that was always going to explode eventually. The question is whether WWE should have let it explode the way it did, or whether management should have stepped in earlier to manage the situation more carefully. And I think the answer is obvious. Of course WWE should have managed this better. You can have intense rivalries, you can have legitimate heat, you can even use that real emotion to enhance your storylines, but you do it in a controlled way that protects everyone involved. What WWE did instead was essentially throw gasoline on a fire and then act surprised when the whole building started burning. They saw that Drew and Jacob had real tension, they decided to exploit that tension for television, and they created an environment where the tension could explode in dangerous and unpredictable ways. Now I want to talk about something that's been bothering me about WWE's recent booking philosophy, because the Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu situation is just the latest example of a troubling trend. WWE seems increasingly willing to push the boundaries of what's safe and what's appropriate in the name of creating moments and viral content. They want everything to feel real, edgy, and unpredictable, but they don't seem to fully appreciate the risks that come with that approach. Think about some of the things we've seen in WWE over the past year: wrestlers being injured in ways that blur the line between work and shoot, backstage attacks that feel disturbingly genuine, promos where people bring up real-life personal issues in ways that make everyone uncomfortable. These things can be effective in the short term, they generate social media buzz, they get people talking, they create water-cooler moments that keep WWE in the conversation. But what's the long-term cost? What happens when fans can't tell the difference between what's real and what's scripted anymore? What happens when wrestlers feel pressured to constantly top each other in terms of realness and intensity? What happens when the line between performance and actual violence becomes so blurred that people get hurt? I'm not saying WWE should go back to the cartoon era of wrestling where everything was obviously fake and no one believed any of it. But there's got to be a middle ground between that and whatever the hell we're doing now, where two wrestlers are genuinely trying to hurt each other backstage and WWE is filming it like it's the greatest thing ever. Let me share some information about the aftermath of the brawl, because what happened in the hours and days following the incident is just as revealing as the incident itself. According to multiple sources, there was an emergency meeting backstage after SmackDown went off the air. Triple H, other members of management, Drew McIntyre, Jacob Fatu, and several veteran wrestlers who serve as locker room leaders all gathered to discuss what had happened and how to prevent similar incidents in the future. The meeting was reportedly tense. Triple H expressed his frustration with both Drew and Jacob for allowing their emotions to override their professionalism. He acknowledged that the footage created compelling television, but he emphasized that the safety of everyone backstage cannot be compromised for the sake of a storyline. He made it clear that if either Drew or Jacob engages in that kind of uncontrolled behavior again, there will be serious consequences including fines, suspensions, or worse. Drew McIntyre reportedly defended himself by saying that Jacob provoked him with comments about his family and his heritage, and that he wasn't going to stand there and take that kind of disrespect. Drew argued that standing up for yourself when someone crosses a line is more important than following corporate guidelines about appropriate behavior. Jacob Fatu apparently had a similar defense, saying that Drew had been disrespecting the Samoan heritage and the Bloodline legacy, and that in his culture, that kind of disrespect demands a physical response. Jacob made the point that WWE hired him specifically because of his intensity and his connection to the Anoa'i family legacy, and that you can't ask him to be less intense when it's convenient for management. Both men make compelling points. Honestly, wrestling is a business that runs on ego, pride, and competitive intensity. You need wrestlers who are willing to stand up for themselves and refuse to be disrespected. But you also need a structure and a set of rules that prevents the competitive intensity from turning into genuine violence that endangers everyone. The veteran wrestlers who were in the meeting reportedly tried to bridge the gap between management's concerns and the wrestlers' perspectives. They acknowledged that both Drew and Jacob have legitimate grievances, but they emphasized that there are appropriate ways to handle those grievances that don't involve destroying equipment and endangering crew members. They suggested that in the future, if tensions are getting that high, wrestlers should immediately inform management so that the situation can be turned into an angle that's filmed in a controlled way rather than allowing it to explode organically. That solution makes sense in theory, but it also kind of defeats the purpose of what made the Drew/Jacob brawl so compelling, the fact that it felt real and uncontrolled. If every spontaneous backstage fight is actually a carefully planned segment filmed with multiple cameras and safety precautions in place, does it have the same impact? Or does it just become another worked shoot that smart fans can see through immediately? This is the fundamental tension at the heart of modern wrestling, the desire for authenticity versus the need for safety and control. And I don't think there's an easy answer to that tension. Every promotion, every creative team, every individual wrestler has to find their own balance between those competing priorities. Let's talk about fan reactions, because the WWE Universe has been loud about their opinions on this situation, and those opinions are all over the map. Social media has been exploding with debate about whether the backstage brawl was awesome or irresponsible, whether WWE should have aired it or kept it private, and whether Drew and Jacob should be punished or rewarded for their intensity. The pro-brawl camp argues that this is exactly what wrestling should be: real emotions, real conflict, real consequences. They're tired of scripted, predictable storylines where everything feels manufactured and fake. They want wrestling that makes them believe, that makes them feel something genuine, that breaks through the cynicism and ironic detachment that characterizes so much of modern pop culture. For these fans, the Drew/Jacob brawl was a breath of fresh air, a reminder that wrestling can still feel dangerous and unpredictable. The anti-brawl camp argues that WWE is being reckless and irresponsible, putting workers in danger for the sake of cheap shock value. They point out that multiple people could have been seriously injured, that expensive equipment was destroyed, and that creating this kind of chaotic environment backstage sets a terrible precedent. They worry that younger wrestlers will feel pressure to engage in similar behavior to get attention, and that someone is eventually going to get seriously hurt or worse because WWE keeps pushing these boundaries. Then there's a middle camp that sees both sides. They acknowledge that the brawl created compelling television, but they wish WWE had handled it differently, maybe staging the fight in a controlled environment rather than letting it happen organically in a space filled with crew members and expensive equipment. They want the intensity and emotion without the actual danger and risk. Where do you fall in this debate? And I really want to know, so drop a comment right now telling me your honest opinion. Was the backstage brawl awesome or reckless? Should WWE have aired it or kept it private? Are you excited for the eventual match between Drew and Jacob, or are you concerned about where this level of intensity leads? Now let's discuss the implications for the actual match that's now scheduled for next week's SmackDown. With all this build-up, with the backstage brawl footage that's been viewed millions of times online, with the live crowd that felt cheated when the original match was cancelled, the pressure on Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu to deliver something special next week is enormous. But here's the problem: how do you possibly live up to that level of hype? The backstage brawl felt so real, so intense, so genuinely dangerous that any worked match is going to pale in comparison. It's the same problem WWE faces anytime they show real footage alongside worked segments. The contrast makes the work stuff look fake and choreographed. Drew and Jacob are going to have to work incredibly hard to make their match feel as intense and compelling as the backstage footage. They're going to have to throw legitimate strikes, take big risks, and push themselves physically in ways that might not be safe or sustainable. And WWE Creative is going to have to come up with spots and moments that feel organic and spontaneous even though they're carefully planned and choreographed. One possible approach is to structure the match as a continuation of the backstage brawl, have them start fighting before the bell even rings, brawl all over the arena, use the environment creatively, and generally create the sense that this is still the same uncontrolled conflict rather than a traditional match. That could help maintain the authenticity and intensity of the backstage footage. Another approach is to acknowledge the work nature of the match but lean into it, have commentary constantly reference the backstage brawl and talk about how both men are still carrying injuries or emotional damage from that encounter. Use the fact that we've seen them at their most intense to add layers to the in-ring storytelling. Show them trying to regain control and professionalism while still being consumed by hatred. Either way, this match is going to be a huge test for both Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu. If they deliver, if they manage to create something that lives up to the hype and justifies all the controversy and chaos, then they'll cement themselves as top-tier performers who can work at the highest level. If they disappoint, if the match feels flat or safe or choreographed compared to the backstage brawl, then all of this controversy will have been for nothing. I also want to address something that I've seen in the comments on other videos and on social media, people suggesting that the entire backstage brawl was staged and planned from the beginning. And look, I understand why people would think that. Wrestling is a work, we all know that, and wrestlers and promoters are constantly trying to blur the lines between reality and fiction. But based on my conversations with multiple sources who were actually backstage during the incident, I can tell you with a high degree of confidence that the brawl was not planned in advance. It was a genuine altercation between two men who have legitimate tension, and WWE made the decision to film it and use it rather than shutting it down immediately. Now, does that mean everything about how the brawl played out was totally organic? Probably not. Drew and Jacob are both professional wrestlers with decades of training between them. Even in the heat of the moment, even when genuinely angry, they're going to instinctively protect each other to some degree and work in ways that they know will look good on camera. So while the emotions and the core conflict were real, the execution probably had elements of performance even if it wasn't consciously planned. That's the weird reality of modern wrestling. Even real moments have performative elements because the people involved are so deeply trained in the art of performance that they can't completely turn it off. It's not about working versus shooting, it's about this strange hybrid space where real emotions and worked presentation exist simultaneously. And that's fine. That's actually what makes wrestling unique and compelling as an art form. But we have to be honest about what we're watching and the risks involved, rather than pretending everything is either 100% real or 100% fake. Let me tell you about some of the other wrestlers' reactions backstage, because those reactions provide important context for understanding the culture WWE is creating right now. Several younger wrestlers apparently approached Drew and Jacob after the meeting with management to express their admiration for the intensity they showed. These younger guys saw the brawl as inspiring, as proof that you can still be taken seriously as a tough guy even in the modern era of highly choreographed wrestling. But some of the veteran wrestlers had a very different reaction. They pulled younger talent aside and warned them not to try to emulate what Drew and Jacob did, emphasizing that there's a difference between working stiff and working stupid. They explained that the reason Drew and Jacob can get away with that level of intensity is because they've earned a certain level of trust and respect over years in the business, and that younger wrestlers trying to recreate that energy without the same level of experience and credibility will just get themselves hurt or fired. That generational divide in how people view the brawl is really interesting. Older wrestlers who came up in the territory days or even the Attitude Era remember when backstage fights were relatively common and not always handled well. They remember wrestlers getting seriously hurt or even having their careers ended because of backstage violence that got out of control. So they're naturally more cautious about celebrating this kind of behavior. Younger wrestlers who grew up watching WWE's more sanitized product and who have had to fight tooth and nail to get noticed in an overcrowded industry see intensity and realness as advantages that can help them stand out. They're more willing to take risks and push boundaries because that's what they feel they have to do to succeed. WWE management is caught between these two perspectives, trying to create a product that feels edgy and real enough to satisfy modern audiences while also maintaining the safety standards and professional environment that's necessary in any workplace. The Drew McIntyre versus Jacob Fatu situation perfectly encapsulates the tension. I want to talk about the broader implications for SmackDown's booking and the tag division, because believe it or not, this brawl has ripple effects beyond just Drew and Jacob's individual feud. Jacob Fatu is part of the new Bloodline, which means his actions and positioning affect Solo Sikoa and the rest of that faction. If Jacob is tied up in a heated feud with Drew McIntyre, that limits his availability for Bloodline storylines. Similarly, Drew McIntyre is one of SmackDown's top babyfaces and a potential challenger for whatever championship is being featured at any given time. Having him locked into a personal feud with Jacob Fatu takes him out of the title picture, at least temporarily. That affects booking decisions, match planning, and long-term storytelling for the entire brand. There's also the question of how this feud resolves. Do Drew and Jacob fight until one decisively beats the other? Do they end up respecting each other after beating the hell out of each other? Do outside factors or other wrestlers get involved? The resolution of this feud will say a lot about WWE's philosophy regarding violence, respect, and conflict resolution. If they go the route of "we fought and now we respect each other," that's a fairly traditional wrestling story that sends the message that violence can lead to mutual understanding. If they go the route of one man decisively defeating and humiliating the other, that's a more competitive, sports-oriented approach that establishes a clear hierarchy. If they never really resolve it and just move on to other feuds, that sends the message that personal conflicts don't really matter in the grand scheme of things. Each of those potential resolutions has implications for how fans understand WWE's storytelling and what they can expect from future feuds. This is why even seemingly standalone feuds like Drew vs. Jacob actually matter to the larger narrative fabric of the show. Let me bring this full circle and talk about what I think WWE should do moving forward, because I don't want this to just be a rant about problems without offering solutions. Here's what I would do if I were in charge of managing this situation. First, I would have a clear conversation with both Drew McIntyre and Jacob Fatu about boundaries. Make it explicitly clear what is acceptable in terms of intensity and physicality, and what crosses the line into dangerous or unprofessional behavior. Give them permission to work stiff and be intense, but establish clear guidelines about where and how that intensity can be expressed. Second, I would use this feud to make a statement about the kind of wrestling WWE wants to present. Let Drew and Jacob have their brutal, hard-hitting match next week, but frame it in a way that emphasizes the storytelling and emotional stakes rather than just the violence for violence's sake. Show that you can have intensity without it being reckless or dangerous. Third, I would make sure that any future backstage brawls or spontaneous altercations are handled with clear safety protocols. If you're going to film these moments and air them on television, you need to ensure that crew members and other talent aren't being put in danger. Maybe designate certain areas as safe zones where fights won't spill over, or have specific safety personnel assigned to monitor situations that might escalate. Fourth, I would be transparent with fans about what's real and what's worked. I know that ruins some of the mystique, but I think modern fans actually appreciate honesty more than they appreciate being worked. Let people know that while the emotions and conflict are genuine, WWE is taking steps to ensure everyone's safety and that professional boundaries are being maintained. Finally, I would use this situation as a teaching moment for the rest of the roster. Bring in Drew and Jacob to talk to other wrestlers about what happened, what they learned, and how they would handle it differently in retrospect. Turn this controversy into an opportunity for growth and education rather than just moving on like nothing happened. These aren't perfect solutions, and I'm sure people will disagree with some or all of them, but they represent a way forward that tries to balance intensity and authenticity with safety and professionalism, because that's ultimately what WWE needs to figure out: how to give fans the real, edgy, unpredictable content they crave while also being a responsible employer and entertainment company. As we head into next week's SmackDown, the anticipation for Drew McIntyre vs. Jacob Fatu has never been higher. The backstage brawl footage has been viewed millions of times. Social media is buzzing with predictions and debates. The live crowd next week is going to be electric because they know they're getting the match that last week's audience didn't get to see. But with that anticipation comes enormous pressure and enormous risk. Drew and Jacob have to deliver something special, something that justifies all the controversy and conversation. WWE has to prove that their willingness to push boundaries and blur lines between reality and fiction actually serves the story rather than just creating chaos for chaos's sake. I'll be watching next week with bated breath, hoping that we get an incredible match that becomes an instant classic. But I'll also be watching with concern, worried that in their desire to top the backstage brawl, Drew and Jacob might take unnecessary risks that could lead to injury or worse. Make sure you're subscribed to WrestlingNewsCC with notifications turned on, because I'll be providing immediate reactions, backstage reports, and detailed analysis of whatever happens next week. This is a defining moment for WWE's approach to intensity and realism in wrestling, and the whole industry is watching to see how it plays out. Drop a comment with your predictions, your concerns, and your honest thoughts about this entire situation. Hit that like button if you appreciate honest, critical wrestling analysis that doesn't just blindly praise everything WWE does. And share this video with other fans who are just as invested and concerned as you are about the direction of modern wrestling.